Welcome back to another episode of Your Hope-Filled
Mhm,
Perspective, where it's always our goal to
mhm,
restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in their God-given identity.
mhm.
I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and I don't take it lightly when you choose to spend a few precious moments of your week with us. Today, we're going to be talking about how God can meet you during healing after domestic abuse. My guest today is Karen DeArmond Gardner. You might remember her. She was previously on our program and shared a bit of her story. And that story is compelling and important. So if you missed that episode, I would encourage you to go back and listen. But we wanted to further the conversation today and
Mhm,
really talk about what God did in and through and for her, to
mhm,
focus on our good and faithful God. But to
mhm,
start off today's episode, I want to reflect on Hebrews 4, verse 16, that says, "So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God.
mhm.
There we will receive mercy and we will find grace to help us when we need it most." If you are involved in a domestic abuse situation, in a difficult marriage, maybe some other kind of abuse, I want you to hear that God is waiting for you to boldly approach his throne and he
Mm,
will give you mercy and grace.
mm,
But we're going to talk a little bit more about that in today's episode.
mm,
Karen is a 30-year survivor of domestic abuse and is an advocate for women who have experienced abuse and divorce. She's a certified trauma advocate and facilitates mending the soul and inner healing through HeartSync. Karen blogs at anotheronefree.com. And Karen and her second husband, Tom, are co owners of a private security company and reside in Texas.
mhm.
Welcome back to the program, Karen.
Oh, thank you for having me on again.
You had a really compelling story. And so, to catch up our
Mm,
listeners,
mhm,
what I have found is that so often our passion comes out of our own hurts and trials.
mm.
Would you share just a little bit of your story for those who aren't familiar with it?
As you stated, I was in a 30-year abusive marriage. It was, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought that it was my job for him to become a better man, to walk with Jesus, and I allowed abuse kind of twisted the um, what I read from scripture and what I heard at church, and and not that anybody, well, what do I want to say? Not that for me that the church was telling me I should stay at this point. It was just the abuse talking, and um, of course, since they didn't talk, not should I say, I'm sorry, even though they should have talked about it. They didn't have it when there's tough marriage. My own beliefs that were distorted, twisted whatever I heard. And so as the dawning came, as the awakening came, you might call it, the moment when you realize that this is not part of God's plan, that this is not what he wants for you, that you decide that it's time to leave. And that is just the beginning, just the beginning of um, recognizing that this is not okay and that it's time to leave. And then the next step is, how do you do that? And that is the hard part.
Do you think, Karen, because this has been your experience
Mm,
and not my personal experience, but do you
mhm.
think that's part of the reason so many people stay in an abusive relationship is because leaving is just the first step and
Yes.
everything afterwards is so daunting?
Yes. And it's because if you've been walking with Jesus, you think that you've heard that God hates divorce, even though the scriptures really don't say that. If you go back to the original Hebrew, that is not what it says. but it's how it's been translated in a lot of the different translations, that God hates divorce. And so you really think that you're going against what he wants. And that was part of the discovery, is that he loves me more than he hates divorce, even though it's not what he hates. Um, it's, um, gosh, I'm not even sure. I'm going to leave it right there. I'm not sure what to say next. Um,
Let's talk for just a moment
hmm.
about what constitutes domestic abuse or violence.
It's, most people think it's the battering. It's what we hear about, is a battering. The police are called. She has visible bruises, broken arms. She goes to the hospital quite often. But in reality, that is just the outward sign. There is a term that is becoming more familiar here in the United States, is and excuse me while I try to pronounce it, because I always want to throw a H in this word, but coercion. It's the use of threats of violence to control and to manipulate. And so it's the part you don't see. It's the gaslighting, where if you tell a story, he will say, no, that's not how it happened. You were actually wearing a red dress, not a blue dress, even though you know that you were wearing the blue dress. That's not how it happened. And he gets you to question. Um, he gets you to doubt everything that you know and that you believe. And most of the time, there is no physical violence. And so the question becomes, if he doesn't hit me, is it abuse? But what I've discovered is most of those women, he didn't hit them, but what he did do was shove them, push them, pull their hair, drag them, choke them. But in their brain, it's like, well, he didn't hit me. And there's also pinching and maybe biting, or sexual abuse within marriage. And yes, that can happen. Um, and so there's so much more, and it's more of, you think of what they actually, it can be called intimate terrorism, because it's as if you've been kidnapped by a stranger, only the stranger sleeps in your bed. And so this is the part that nobody sees and women can't explain. There are no words to say, this is what he's doing to me, because you can't find those words.
And on the outside, very typically, the abuser is very charismatic.
Mhm,
He's
yeah.
very likable.
Yep,
And
yep.
so it sets up this dynamic where
Mhm.
they're believed over
Right,
the person that they are abusing.
right. Yes, he's charismatic. He's he's articulate, and she looks slightly unbalanced and slightly crazy, which is the setup. It's designed that way, and she's been isolated, and it is designed that way so that if she ever does tell the secret, no one will believe her, because look at what he's had to put up with. She's just kind of crazy. She's full of anxiety. And that is one of the signs of domestic abuse, is when he looks cool, calm, and collected, and she looks the opposite of that. She's not cool and collected. She's so full of anxiety. And it's the belief, when you go into counseling and marriage counseling, which is terrible to do, but if you go into marriage counseling, is counselors can be won over by his
Yeah.
behavior, by his being so articulate, and looking at her, she looks like she's the problem, and he can literally convince a seasoned counselor that she's the problem and not him.
How prevalent is domestic abuse?
um the numbers are 1 in 4, um but out of reported cases, just reported, 14% are what we would call battering,
Okay.
where there's physical violence that occurs. That is the gist. He beats her up all the time. and the control and manipulation are secondary to the violence. But 86% of reported cases are the opposite. The coercion is the main thing, and the violence is secondary. It's not as often and or doesn't happen at all. And so you think about of reported cases. And so if you think about that within church, how much is not reported within the church?
Now, I want to
Um,
clarify for our listeners because you are speaking from your own personal experience. And
mhm,
so your abuser was your ex husband,
mhm.
but it's not always a male abuser.
Right, right. Mhm.
Sometimes women are the
Yes,
abuser, and
yes.
that's less common,
Mhm,
but it's important
mhm.
to keep in mind because it's not always the male against the female.
Right, right.
Sometimes it's the other way. And
Mhm.
in those same sex relationships, you can have abuse there as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I know someone who was in, and she wasn't close to home. She was isolated, and she was the abuse. Yes. I even had some interaction with um, a male couple with just him as a victim, and his, I gave him the same advice I would give to a woman, even within that same sex relationship. It's the same advice. You have to choose to leave, but there was a threat that I will ruin your career. And he had a very prevalent career. I will ruin you. And that theme seems to run out. So it doesn't matter um, what type of relationship it is. It's the tactics are all the same.
And frequently, it is the threat of ruining your
Hmm.
reputation.
Hmm. Right.
And we
Right.
try so hard to maintain a good reputation. So it might be, I'm going to ruin your reputation within the church, or,
Hmm.
or like you said, within the career, or
Right.
even within your own family.
Right. And it's also that that they make you complicit in what they do. So if they're abusive towards the children in any way, they have you believing that if you do something, if you turn me in, you will be complicit and you will suffer just as I do. And so they will make you complicit, whether it's in that or something illegal or something that's borderline, and in your mind the belief is that you're just as guilty as he is.
Friends, we're going to take a real quick 1 minute commercial break, but I want you to stick with us because while we've now just kind of caught you up to date on the highlights of Kieran's story and the definition of abuse and what to look for, we really want to turn this episode around and talk
Mhm.
about hope for healing
Yeah,
after domestic abuse.
yeah.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to your hope filled perspective.
Mhm.
Today, we're talking with my friend Karen DeArmond Gardner, and we're talking about hope for healing after domestic abuse.
Mhm.
In our last episode, we discussed Karen's journey through domestic abuse and divorce. But in
Mhm.
this episode, I really want to focus on the positive since we
Mhm.
know that what the enemy intends for evil,
Mhm.
God will use for good.
Right.
So, Karen, I'd love for you to share in what ways did God meet you
Mhm.
after you took that difficult step and left your husband?
I think one of the biggest ways was that he allowed me to be angry and to open the floodgates of silence. He wasn't worried about decorum or what I said or how I said it, and and I don't I appreciate that more today than I did then. I didn't understand that then. Um, because I was angry at him. I was angry at myself, and I recognize today, all these years later, how much he allowed me just to experience all the pain and to say things that maybe weren't right, or to just in some cases just vomit my story out. And that was, honestly, when I look back, I realize how precious that was of him.
That's really important for our listeners to hear because I think sometimes, especially if we are raised in a very religious church,
Mhm.
we can be left with um, the lie that we
Mhm.
can't get angry with God.
Right.
And God is big enough to handle any or all of our emotions.
Right. Mhm.
And He knows from whence we've come, and He knows where He's taking us. And
Mhm.
sometimes getting out that anger, that doubt, that discouragement, that frustration is part of the journey to
Yeah.
get to the healing
Yeah.
that He wants for us. Did
Yeah.
your view of God change while you were in a domestic abusive marriage or after you divorced your abuser?
I realize now um, how much the my ex-husband replaced himself as God in my life.
Uh,
Um, be and so it, it
Say that
so
again.
then when I came out,
What did you realize?
that the abuser, hmm?
What did you realize?
That he replaced God in my life, that I my view of God was so distorted that I assumed he was very much like my ex-husband, controlling and manipulative, and that I could never do anything right. And even though I had moments with God where I heard him and he was comforting, and I would sit as if I was sitting on his lap, but the overall was the distortion. And so then when I came out, um, it the word now is going around as deconstruction, but that is literally what happened. I had to deconstruct what I believed about God and who I believed him to be. Deconstruct scripture that had been twisted, that said, well, you're just suffering for Jesus, and this is just momentary light affliction. All of those things I had to undo to be able to discover who God really is. And that was a long, long process. For some, it's not quite as long. For others, it's a really long time. And God is okay with that.
What did you experience when you attended church?
I had a range of emotions. When I left and came the state I was in and came to Texas, my family was going to a church and they were really welcoming. And but some of the things that I heard um, one day, whatever he was talking about the women in the Bible, and I don't know what he said, but I just got so upset. And by the end of church, I literally just ran out of the building and or out of the sanctuary, and I ran out into the bathroom, and I was just sobbing, and I was so angry and so upset. um, and my sister-in-law looked for me up on the altar because she was going to pray with me. Oh no, I ran. I just ran, and because I just couldn't face it. It's like, if God is all of this, where the heck was He when I was in the midst of all this? Why didn't He rescue me sooner? Why did it take so long? What were you doing? And all of those things just came pouring out of me. And this poor girl that was in the restroom got the whole brunt of it. She got all of it. And she had no words. She didn't know what to say or what to do. And she didn't need to, because I just had to let it out. And, and it wasn't pretty. And so there were moments of that. And then there were other moments where I could just worship him and thank him for being out, that I was free and I was no longer in that. So it was an up and down. And and then I was still trying to be, when it was up, I was still trying to be the good Christian girl and not be angry at God, and and So there was a lot of counterfeit going on, which is normal. That's okay. Because you don't know what to do. You don't know how to behave.
Yeah. When you look back,
Mm.
how can you see God at work
Oh gosh.
through that
Mm.
healing journey?
Yeah, he was. What I've discovered is God is really gracious and kind in our healing. He allows, just like he did Gideon when he showed up to Gideon, and even though Israel was in a place they were because they left God and worshiped idols, Gideon didn't see that. He was, when the angel of the Lord showed up, he said, he called him mighty warrior. And the Lord is with you. Okay, if he's with me, why did he allow this? And where was he? And why are you doing this? Why would God do all this to us? And the angel of the Lord said, called him a mighty warrior and said, well, you're going to rescue. You're the one who's going to rescue Israel. That's not what he wanted here. He didn't answer any of the whys or the whats, and God didn't answer the whys and the whats. But he let me say the whys. Why didn't you? Where were you? How come? He allowed me to say those. And again, I appreciate that so much more now than I did then, because all I got in return was silence. Um, and I recognized that those questions, the
You
answers
recognize what?
would not help me. The answers, the answers would not help. The answers were facts. They weren't truth. They were facts. He, you, why did it happen? Is because my ex was an abuser, and he tricked me, and he controlled me, and he abused me, and it wasn't God. Where was God? He was there all along. I just couldn't see him or feel him at times, and I ran away from him. Well, that wasn't going to help me. That did not help me. And so he didn't answer. Through time, through healing, I discovered the answers to a lot of the whys and the whats and the wheres and the hows, but it came through healing.
Has your relationship with God changed since all of those questions?
Yeah. And I have been out at the time of this recording, it's been a little over 16 years, but more in the last 5 years um, as I've got to know him better, I've discovered that he is so much kinder than I ever imagined. He's not, he's not the domineering God that I thought he was. He's not. He doesn't want to control me or manipulate me. Um, he's his love is so much more than I ever imagined, and um, he's the Ephesians 20. He's just beyond anything that I could imagine, and um, and and we don't do him justice. We don't do him justice at all. Mm.
Friends, we're going to take a real quick commercial break, but you know this program is your hope-filled perspective. So it,
Mm.
it wouldn't be like this program if we didn't ask Karen what her hope-filled perspective is for you today.
Mhm.
We'll do that when we come back.
Mm.
Welcome back to your
Mm.
hope-filled perspective. Today we've been talking about how God can move in and through healing
Mm.
after domestic abuse.
Mm.
And Karen, you were sharing how your perception of God changed.
Mm.
I'm sure some are listening right now and they're wondering, is there really life after abuse?
Mm.
Maybe they're in the abuse right now, or maybe they've
Mm.
just left. And like you mentioned in the very beginning, that's very daunting. That's just the first step.
Mm.
What would you say to that woman or that man who's wondering,
Mm.
is my life even going to be worth living if I leave?
It is, but it's a black hole. The future looks like a black hole, and abuse tends to draws the trauma is so in front of our face that we cannot see beyond that, and that is okay. That when you cannot see beyond into the future. We know what to expect from the past. We know what trauma is. We know what abuse looks like. And that it's a fact. We know it. The future, on the other hand, is unknown, and we can't even imagine abundance, can't imagine that anything could be better than it is today. Um, Many times we're taught through church that it's all about getting saved. We come to Jesus, and then life is hard and horrible until we get to heaven, and it's all good. And that's not true. The abundant life is true. Even in the midst of hard, horrible circumstances, we can experience abundant life, but it will take time. Healing, leaving is just the beginning of discovering truth. There are, there has been, through abuse, there's so much cognitive dissonance that where our mind has adapted to get us through that we may take the blame. We may believe that we really love him. We may believe that he just couldn't help himself. And as we heal from the one who vowed to love us, and see, that is the crux. That is the hard part, is we're healing from what someone else did to us, someone who said they loved us, someone who we did life with, and we have to heal from what they did, why they go on their merry way as if nothing ever happened. Um, that is hard and it is daunting, but it's not impossible, and it just takes time. And there's no cookie cutter way through that healing process. Even though in my book, I 12 chapters, there is to those chapters, but healing doesn't happen in that order. It is it is a bounce around. It is God meets us where we are, and the realization that Jesus knows what we experience. He knows the betrayal. He knows having the people closest to you betray you and violate you, and he knows the pain. I mean, he looked Peter in the eye as Peter betrayed him, and Peter vowed he would never betray him, and he did. Everyone left. Everyone left him, but the women stuck around. I love that part. um, he knows what it's like to be exposed. You know, on that cross, he didn't have a loincloth on. The man was completely stripped. His dignity was exposed. He was battered and beaten and lied about. And he understands the betrayal that we've experienced. And yet he bore all of that on himself. And to discover that Jesus understands abuse and that God never intended, he hates he hates abuse. Proverbs 6:16 through 19. He is very explicit about how he feels about abuse, and his desire is to heal the brokenhearted. Isaiah 61 is about setting the captives free, that he wants to take our pain and the ashes of our burned up life and exchange it for something beautiful and glorious that only he can do. And that is hard to see when you leave, and it will take time to get there. And guess what? He is okay with that.
I think it's important too to mention that, when I asked you if there's life after abuse, and
Mm,
one of the first things that you said is, yes, there is, but it looks like a black hole.
Mhm.
because you're right, you don't know what the future holds. But
Mhm.
what I think is important to consider is that if you stay in an abusive relationship,
Mhm.
it's a black hole.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you can choose to stay in
Mhm.
what you already know
Mhm.
is a very dangerous situation, or you can choose to step out in faith that God will bring you through
Yes.
it
Yeah. Yeah.
and things will be better.
Yeah.
If you trust him, if you hold on to his hand, sometimes if you'll just hold on to the hem of his garment.
Mhm. Yes. Yes.
Karen, you know that I always end up this program asking my guest if someone is going through what you've gone through, or they have a loved one who is, what hope filled perspective would you offer them?
Um, if you're in it, you don't have to stay in it. God doesn't expect you to stay. This is not his design. It's not his plan. Yes, it will be hard to leave. It will be scary. Um, but his promise really never fails, that he won't leave us or forsake us. However, it is also the most dangerous time. Even if he's never been violent, it is the most dangerous time is in the leaving. So you plan. You don't just leave. You don't tell him that you're leaving. You plan in secret. And you may even have to be deceptive with him. And that's God's okay with that, because he doesn't expect you to go and tell your abuser all your plans. And I always think of Corrie Ten Boom when if you ever read her story from World War II, the Nazis asked, "Do you have a radio?" And she lied, said, "No, we don't." Corrie Ten Boom, if you learn her history, is one of the most amazing godly women you'll ever know, and she lied. And sometimes we have to do that in our preparation to leave. Find someone you can trust that will listen to you, because not everyone will believe you because you've kept the secret so well. And so find someone you can trust, reach out, because this is not God's plan for your life. The leaving is his plan. He will meet you at every step of the way. Even if you're angry with him, even if you don't trust him, he's still going to be there, because he can't not do that.
Karen, thank you for sharing your story and the hope
Mhm.
that you found through your healing journey. Friends, I want to leave you with two scriptures for you to hang on to.
Mm.
The first is Galatians 5:1 that says, "So Christ has truly set us free.
Mhm.
Now make sure that you stay free and
Yeah.
don't get tied up again in slavery to the law." Friends, he came to set you free.
Mhm.
He does not want you to stay in an abusive relationship.
Right.
He wants you to find your freedom in him. And then the second verse is
Yeah.
Ephesians 3, verse 20. Now, all glory to God, who is able, through his mighty power at work
Mhm.
within us, to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think.
Yes. Yes.
Karen just shared about how scary it can be to
Mhm.
leave,
Mhm.
how potentially very dangerous it can be. But you have a God who cares about you, about your safety, about your well being, and he will do more for you than you could ever think or imagine. But you've got to be willing to turn to him and ask for his help. Friends, you might not be in
Mhm.
a domestic abusive relationship, but I guarantee you know someone who is. You may not know that they are. But this is a
Mhm.
particularly important episode because of the staggering statistics that we heard. Would you consider sharing this episode on your social media so that those who are involved in an abusive relationship or love those who are
Mhm.
Find the hope that Karen has shared today through Jesus Christ. As always, this has been your hope filled perspective. Until next week, I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson. May you make it a hope filled week.
Yeah.